Welcome to Work Energy Reflections. This is a space where we explore energy, embodiment, work, and the landscapes that shape our lives. This podcast today begins with a simple but important question. What would change if we stopped treating human exhaustion as a personal failure and started asking whether the landscapes we move through actually support life? Because many of us were taught how to perform, how to push, how to achieve, how to persist. But very few of us were taught how to sustain ourselves while doing it. That's where this work begins, with nourishment. Not as indulgence, not as escape, but as preparation for demand before collapse requires intervention. So at Work Energy Lab, I explore energy through three interconnected lenses: the individual, the relational, and through organizations. The individual lens asks what supports life inside a single human being. The relational lens explores how people affect one another energetically through leadership, communication, trust, conflict, and connection. And the organizational lens asks, how do workplaces, structures, and cultural landscapes either sustain or deplete the people inside them? All three matter because sustainable energy is never just personal. It lives inside people, between people, and eventually in the landscapes that we build together. But this series begins with the individual lens, because before we can explore teams, leadership, or organizational dynamics, we have to understand the human nervous system living inside those environments. We have to understand capacity, recovery, embodiment, regulation, attention, rest, movement, and the rhythms that allow life to remain sustainable while we are under demand. Because this is not about leaving. It's about staying with energy and purpose. This is where nourish before demand begins. So I've been spending a lot of time thinking about the word nourish. And the reason I've been thinking about when I started this exploration, it was a side thought to help support this growing platform. And I started this conversation around morning routines and simple things. And that matters, but it's so much deeper than that. And the more expansive it became, most people hear nourish and immediately think food, rest, or self-care. And honestly, that's where I started. But nourishment is much deeper than comfort. To nourish means to provide what is necessary. This can be for life, for growth, for restoration or vitality. It's sustainable becoming, not just survival. Life. It's repair and capacity, coherence. The word itself comes from a root meaning to feed, to foster, to sustain, and to support. And I think that distinction matters because many of us have learned how to keep functioning without actually feeling nourished in our personal interactions with ourselves, with our interactions with other people, and in our work environments. We know how to continue, but not necessarily how to restore. And there's a difference. Something can stimulate us without nourishing us. Something can energize us temporarily while quietly depleting us in the long term. You've probably felt this before. Scrolling for an hour and somehow feeling more exhausted afterward. Pushing through a workday on adrenaline or an extreme amount of caffeine, only to crash later. Or the opposite. A short walk, a deep breath, a meaningful conversation, a good meal, a moment of honesty, and suddenly your system feels different. More settled, more clear, more connected. That's the difference between stimulation and nourishment. Nourishment is not always soft. Sometimes it looks like sleep and movement. Sometimes it's grief and sitting with that grief. There's structure, breath and release, truth, recovery. There's a lot that can be fit into that word. Sometimes nourishment is saying yes. Sometimes nourishment is finally saying no. But the nourishment tends to increase when it's true. It increases steadiness and resilience, adaptability, and sustainable capacity. It helps us to remain connected to life while engaging in the demand. And maybe that's the shift. Not waiting until burnout to recover. Not waiting until the body forces us to stop. But learning how to support life earlier in the process. To nourish before demand escalates beyond what the body and mind or workplace can sustainably hold. So I keep returning to this phrase, the space between action, because most landscapes condition us to move from one demand directly into the next, without pause, without integration, without collaboration, sometimes without communication. And eventually the nervous system stops experiencing life as engagement and starts experiencing it as accumulation. Accumulated stress, accumulated pressure, accumulated activation. The space between action is where we interrupt that cycle. It's the space where we breathe, where we regulate, reconnect, prepare, and restore before the next wave arrives. Sometimes that space is an hour. Sometimes it's 5 minutes. Sometimes it's breath before answering the next email. Sometimes it's sleep instead of pushing harder. Sometimes it's stepping into the sunlight. The point is it's not perfection. The point is learning to participate in ourselves, with our environment in a way that is sustainable. This episode began a larger exploration of Nourish Before Demand through the individual lens. In the episodes ahead, we'll explore nourishment through awareness, breath, movement, curiosity, emotional capacity, and the small recalibrations that help prepare us for demand. Later, we'll widen the lens into relational and organizational nourishment, the space between people and the workplace landscapes we move through, and the structures that shape energy every day. But first, we begin here, with the individual, with a human being inside the landscape. Thank you for spending this time with me today. This is Work Energy Lab Reflections, designing landscapes that support life at work and beyond. And until next time, nourish before demand.